The rematch is on. Oregon, Ohio State. It was supposed to be the Big Ten championship game. Alas, here we are in the Rose Bowl. Now, there's something strangely poetic about this particular matchup. Oregon, Ohio State, Rose Bowl. When I was growing up, back in my day, that was a non-conference BCS game that Oregon really wanted to win. That I really wanted Oregon to win, even though it didn't have direct national championship implications for that particular year. Of course, it did for carrying over to the preseason rankings the following year, but we've done away with all of that. So that was the first thing that popped into my head. The second thing that popped into my head was what Ohio State did to Tennessee on Saturday night in Columbus. That was not a defeat. That was not a big win. That was a beatdown, a thrashing, a take them to the woodshed and beat them with a 2x4. So I was incredibly impressed with Ohio State. And there was one thing in particular I said going in and thought coming out was my number one thing to watch if Oregon ended up matching up with Ohio State again. What is that offensive line looking like? They lost their Remington Award-winning center. Imagine if you took JPJ off of last year's team. How would you have felt? Not great. Not great. And Ohio State went against a really good defensive line in Tennessee. 0 sacks. 0 sacks allowed, which is, by the way, how many times Ohio State sacked Oregon in the game on October 12th at Autzen Stadium. And what was one of the big takeaways from that game? Josh Connerly, Johnny Cornelius. Cha-ching! Money coming their way because those were NFL edges and they didn't get to Gabriel in any consistent way. So that performance for Ohio State's offensive line, incredibly impressive. They lost 2 starters from guys who they would have put on their first 5 up front coming into this year. They have reshuffled a lot and they dominated. They absolutely dominated. Ohio State could run the ball. Will Howard wasn't pressured. They had time to take shots down the field. They took shots down the field again across the board. I actually picked Tennessee to upset Ohio State because I thought that Michigan loss was hanging over the locker room. Well, they have clearly exercised those demons because that was the Ohio State team that we all thought coming into the year could win the national championship. So if Ohio State plays like that, Oregon better bring their A game. That was an A-plus game from Ohio State. How many times this year would you say Oregon has had an A-plus game where they play perfectly complementary football on both sides? The offense is explosive and doing a lot of different things and executing and not getting in their own way, and the defense is just stifling. There have been games where Oregon's done that this year. I think Illinois qualifies as that particular kind of effort. I think Washington was close, but it wasn't quite as perfect. That was only 28-14 at the half. Ohio State was up 21-0 before Tennessee was able to pull their hands out of their pockets. I mean, it was just a thumping, a complete and total beatdown. It was very impressive. I think the Purdue game falls into that category for Oregon, and I think they played incredibly well against Ohio State. It wasn't perfect. Remember, they had the extra point debacles, and it wasn't their fault, but the replay review in the first quarter, there were a number of things. The failed goal-to-go situation in the third quarter of that game, Oregon had some real mistakes. I mean, heck, yeah, they kicked the go-ahead game-winning field, what ended up being the game-winning field goal, but again, goal-to-go, didn't punch it into the end zone. Ohio State's defense has been really, really good inside the 5-yard line this year, but Oregon scored on the first possession inside the 5, and then after that, they had a lot of long touchdowns. So there are aspects of that game that Oregon, non-official related, can clean up and has to be better at if Ohio State plays that particular way. But the offensive line playing as they did, maybe Tennessee wasn't ready for the cold. I don't suspect that was the case. They were moving guys around. They were controlling the line of scrimmage. Chip Kelly and Ryan Day. It turns out those guys are not complete and utter buffoons as coaches and had a bad day against Michigan. No argument here. But they just showcased why they still have national championship potential, why this is still the closest point spread of any of the quarterfinal games. You've got Penn State minus 10.5 against Boise. You've got Texas minus 13.5 against the Fighting Kenny Dillinghams. And you have got, actually, that's not true. Georgia is a slight 1.5 point favorite against Notre Dame. And guess what? The 4 best teams in this playoff, Georgia with Gunnar Stockton, I don't know. But I think Notre Dame is really good. Well, what do you know? So the good news for Oregon fans is if Oregon gets this done, and that's an if, because that version of Ohio State is really dangerous. I'll touch on that more in a sec. But if Oregon is able to get this done, no one's going to be able to say the path was easy. No one's going to be able to say, well, you just caught a break here. Nope, that's not going to fly. So there's the upside for fans. But should you be nervous about Ohio State? 100%. Because just like the matchup at Autzen, this is a coin flip game. If Ohio State's going to look like that, and what we have seen from Oregon, it's a coin flip game. Execution, key moments, special teams, turnover, those sorts of things feel like how the game ultimately gets decided. But going into this matchup, one of you asked me a question, a couple of you did, about, hey, Tennessee or Ohio State, who would you rather play? Who would you rather play? And I said, well, Ohio State is, it seems the more dangerous of the two teams, but Tennessee's defense can be really good. Tennessee can really run the ball. Look at what Penn State just did to Oregon. And Josh Heupel, though the offense is not what it used to be, is still a good offensive mind. I'm sure he'd figure some things out. But what I said about Ohio State is something that I certainly felt after the game as well. When they lost to Michigan, I didn't view their ceiling as being any different. Because the receivers were still healthy. The defense was still healthy. And Will Howard is still there, and I've seen him play well. He is the only quarterback this season to go for 300 yards or more against Oregon's defense. Only one. So I know that team, that version of Ohio State was still in there. What Michigan showed, at least for a rivalry game, is their floor is different. And that's why I was so intrigued to watch the offensive line. And why? Yeah, I'm more worried about Ohio State now than I was going into the game, because the offensive line didn't just hold serve, play average, do enough to win. They were utterly dominant in that game against Tennessee. And Oregon's defensive line, coming off its worst game of the year, they best figure it out, or Will Howard will chuck it all over the yard. Those deep balls he threw to Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka all day, they were beautiful. And Chip Kelly was in his bag. Shocker, Chip Kelly knows offense. Who would have thought? He had receivers running free all day against a really good Vols defense. Go look at what they did in conference play in the SEC this year. They were really good, and Ohio State torched them. Now, nobody's going to be at home, but the weather's not going to be a factor, whether that helped Ohio State's defense or not. It's going to be nice weather on New Year's Day in all likelihood at the Rose Bowls. It always is. So I think it'll be a great game. I think Ohio State is every bit as dangerous as they have been all year, especially after a confidence boost like that. They did not just beat Tennessee. They absolutely throttled them, and it was from the jump. They were ready to go on both sides, and they dominated. Oregon better be ready to play.